All right. Love all to see everybody having a great time talking to one another. All right, so we're in the book of Matthew, and we have covered the first 12 chapters. And in our class this year, we've been one of the things we've been pointing out is that Matthew oscillates back and forth between narrative and then sections that are teaching, narrative and teaching, although he does teach in narrative also. And so you can kind of see the pattern as we went from the beginnings to the Sermon on the Mount to a couple chapters packed with miracles to the sending out of the 12 apostles. And then we had this past week, chapters 11 and 12, where we start to see the Pharisees coming out against Jesus and actually beginning to plot to destroy him. And that leads us into chapter 13. And we got into chapter 13 on Wednesday. We started with the parable of the sower. Chapter 13 is full of parables. We've got a bunch of parables to read today. I want to remind you that the purpose of parables, it was to take something from everyday life and to cast it alongside a spiritual truth, to shed light and understanding on the spiritual truth. It's interesting, with these parables, sometimes they're not, Jesus doesn't explain every single one. And so it's interesting, when you read them, if you go and start looking at different commentaries and things, people have different ideas as to what these parables mean. And so I don't know, it's just kind of, I've got some very straightforward spiritual truths that I've pulled out of these parables this time around, and we'll definitely open it up here if you feel like I'm missing something. But I think it's good to go with what's bold-faced right in front of you, obvious spiritual truth, right? And then everybody agrees on that. Okay, so we covered parable of the sower on Wednesday. That was about sowing the seed, right, and the different ways that people respond to the word, the different, whether or not they receive it, or whether the word gets choked out, or whether someone might fall away having received the word and then doesn't have the roots. Remember the rocky soil, and then there's the good soil that produces. We're going to jump right into our reading for today, starting in verse 24, which is the parable of the weeds. In my translation, it probably may say tares. I don't know, is that how you pronounce that word? I never use the word tares in everyday life, but in your translation. So we'll start in verse 24. Matthew 13, verse 24. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first, bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.' He put another parable before them, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown, it is larger than all the plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches.' He then told them another parable. 'The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened.' All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, said nothing to them without a parable. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. 'I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world.' Then he left the crowds and went into the house, And his disciples came to him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." He answered, "The one who sows the seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest at the end of the age, and reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. The kingdom of leaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went out and sold all that he had and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be the weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? Oh, no, I'm stopping there. I put the wrong verses on there. Whoops, sorry about that. But that's where I wanted to stop for now. Wait, no, I want to do 3 more verses. I apologize. So we're at verse 51. Have you understood all these things? They said to him, yes. And he said to them, therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house, who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old. And there we'll stop. Okay, that's the end of the teaching. Okay, so in this section, Jesus starts with verse 24 with a parable of the weeds. And the general story goes, there's a man who sows good seed in his field, and here the seed, well, we'll talk about what things are in just a second. And then an enemy sows weeds among the wheat, and then when the grain sprout, both wheat and weeds are noticed, right? Okay, and so then the servants offer to pull up the weeds, but the master says, no, wait until the harvest. Wait until harvest time, and then we can separate it all out. And then that happens, and the wheat is gathered into the master's barn, and the weeds are bundled and burned. So that's the general, rundown of that parable, right? Of everything that happened. And so then Jesus later on explains what the different symbols are in this parable at around verse 36. We have the man who sows is the Son of Man, and that's Jesus. We know that's Jesus, how he refers about himself. And then we have the enemy, who is the devil. We have the field, which is the world, he clearly says. We have good seed, which is not the word of God this time, right? The seed is now, that was the sower last Wednesday. Now, the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. And then the weeds are the sons of the wicked one. And then we have the harvest, which represents the end of the age, which, based on everything else that we read in the New Testament, you could say that's when Christ returns. It's the judgment day. Just look at 1 Thessalonians 4 or something like that, and it becomes pretty clear, right? And then we have the reapers, which are angels, or those who harvest, the reapers, right? The angels. Okay, so those are the things that Jesus gives us. And then he further says that, the Son of Man will send out his angels, and all things that offend, or all things that cause sin, all the stumbling, who are stumbling blocks, and those who practice lawlessness will be cast into a fiery furnace, but the righteous will shine forth in the kingdom of their Father, right? So I just basically told you everything we read, right? So now we have to take a step back and say, well, what spiritual truth or truths do we learn from this parable? And we could also lump in the parable of the net or the dragnet, because they give the same message, or they shed light on the same spiritual truth, have the same basic content. So for this question, what I'd like to do is I'd like for you to kind of group up with those in your general vicinity and see what you can draw out of this parable. You might not draw a lot. I don't know. There are some little things you could draw that are a little less obvious, aside from the main point. But I'll give you a couple minutes to talk about it and discuss it, and then we will share out and see what you come up with. So talk with those in your general vicinity. You might have to move a little bit. All right, we'll go ahead and start wrapping it up. And do we have a mic runner? There's somebody. Yay, Daniel. Oh, Alex is already ready to go. So, if you're willing, those who are willing to raise your hand and tell us what you came up with or where you landed. And let's hear it. All right, Brian, thank you for getting us. Oh, no. All right, Wayne.
So y'all may not know me. I'm Wayne. This is Shandis. We're visiting, but I'm not shy either. So what our group kind of came up with was the first most obvious thing is to see what this is actually talking about, and that is that there is actually an end coming, and part of that end is that it's going to be divided between those who are saved, who are going to heaven, and those who are lost and going to hell. And unfortunately, sometimes when we read these parables, it's just like, okay, I'm going to look for the deeper meaning right off the bat. but the easy meaning is right in our face, which is that there will be that separation. Kind of another layer that we added to this as a group is that there are times when we all want to pull away from the world that we're currently in and have the righteous people over here and the evil people over there, but that's not possible. We have to be together, and we have to live together, and we have to be in the world but not of the world. And so the end is coming, and the end is when we're separated. But for now, we have to be together and try to influence those who are around us, but stay rooted in the truth the whole time.
All right. Excellent. Man, I'm glad I let y'all tell me. You delivered that better than I would have. Thank you. Brian.
Well, I don't know that I can add much to that. He stole my thunder, or our thunder, but we thought of two things here. Number one, that obviously this explains the coexistence of the evil and the righteous, the sons of God, and the source of those two groups. Clearly, at the end of age, the separation of the evil from the good, and then I couldn't help but try to draw a connection between this one and the parable of the sower and the seed, which gave forth the sons of men, the seed at that point being the word of God that falls into the hearts of good men, of the good soil, that produce the wheat of the second parable. So that's about it.
Okay. I think that's all well said, and mostly all we need from this. I don't know, since I can't help but there were a few little things that I noticed that you could perhaps infer out of it. They're not off the wall or anything. I think it's interesting, that it says, the righteous will be gathered, right? So there is this kind of a hint that man could be considered righteous, but we're marred with sin, so it already starts to point towards the cleansing, which anyway. So I thought that was interesting that it was we see that in there. We also see that the angels will facilitate the separating. Not a huge important fact, right? But in both the parable of the net and in the parable of the weeds, that's clearly stated. But yeah, so the end is coming, and I think perhaps it's called the parable of the weeds. That's the ones that are burned. They're supposed to be, perhaps a warning of what could happen, if you don't follow Jesus, right? If you don't become a son of the kingdom. So let's move on. There's a clicker. Okay, so after the parable of the weeds, and it's stuck again. I don't know. Yes.
While we're taking another station break, see if I can do this in 60 seconds. The parable of the dragnet is interesting to me. I know this is not quite the context, but I think it helps me with Jesus' description of his disciples or his apostles as fishers of men. And the parable of the dragnet shows us, one, what fishing was really like in those days when Jesus said that. It's not like fishing is today, where you have a bait and you throw it out to catch a single fish. Fishing was just taking a net and dragging in a whole bunch of stuff, and then you separate the good from the bad in the end. And so I think when Jesus calls his disciples, and by extension us, fishers of men, it's not so much about going out and trying to find the right bait and catch individual souls. I think the idea is that we go out and we proclaim the gospel to as many people as we can in our lives. We tell everybody the good news about Jesus. And in the end, everyone that hears it, some will accept it, some will reject it. That's not our job to determine that or to do that for them. But in the end, everyone has heard the message. Everyone will be separated in the end, and it's our job just to cast a wide net as we can possibly do in our lifetime.
All right, thank you. I didn't want to discount the parable of the net, but thank you. Yeah. That's definitely, one thing I did read is that that was definitely part of the process also at the end. You know, you would have so many fish pulled by this gigantic net that you then had to separate what you had caught. But so those who had fish that way, they would really be like, yeah, I totally understand this. Okay, so next we have the parable of the mustard seed and the leaven. They're kind of characterized as a double parable because they make the same basic point, and the repetition is perhaps just for emphasis, right? So if we look at the parable of the mustard seed, the kingdom of heaven, it says, is like a mustard seed, right? Which is the least of all seeds, but grows bigger than the herbs into a tree. That's what my translation says. And it's kind of interesting because and you may know this, but mustard seeds, there's a mustard plant. Of course, that one looks real big because the camera is very close. So it kind of looks like a tree. But for the most part, the mustard plants we would see, they would not resemble a tree. However, I think that's part of the point, is just what the power of God is capable. We start with something small and unassuming, right? Start with Jesus, right? It's actually perhaps, right? Like nobody expected, not many thought he was the Messiah. And some people thought, well, once we kill him, this will be over, right? And so they were like small, unassuming, just stifle it out. But then it grows into something huge, the kingdom of heaven, something powerful, and something, it says that birds rest in, and people have all kinds of ideas about birds being different things. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't know. That's just providing good for what's around it, which is what the kingdom does, right? It blesses others, as Steve was saying. We serve others. Anyhow, so, the most basic interpretation of the spiritual truth is a large heavenly kingdom will grow from something small, right? Nobody could disagree that it's getting at that. I think I covered, this. Okay. Yeah. So we got. I hope I don't go too fast. Oh dear. So far, I've always not been fast enough. But anyhow, we'll finish whenever we finish. But then next to the parable of the mustard seed, we have this parable of the leaven, right? And it says the kingdom of heaven is like leaven that is hid in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. And this is an interesting parable. I mean, same basic point, right? You start with something small and it grew, right? There's a few perhaps kind of different implications though with leaven. Leaven's usually something that's evil, right? But here it's not. Definitely not, right? Kingdom of heaven is like leaven, so which is kind of surprising in some ways. You would, it's all backwards, but and maybe that's part of the spiritual truth. Like this kingdom is upside down. Things are different than people thought they would be. That wasn't even in my notes, so don't think too hard on that. All right, but anyway, so this leaven was hidden in the flour. Perhaps there's again the unexpected. Like it was hidden. Like some people didn't know it was there, and then it grew right into something bigger. So it was an unexpected growth for some people. And then I think it's interesting, maybe the process. Now, I'm no expert on any of this, but it says it was all leavened at the end. So there's some kind of conversion process going on, right, with this leaven and this flour. And I think, and then, I do know this, because a couple years ago, we went to my grandmother's house. I call her Oma, because she lives in New Braunfels, and she's German. But she makes the best rolls, y'all. They won grand prize at the fair, blue ribbon grand prize. They are awesome. I get to eat them at the holidays, all right? But I wanted, she's getting older, and I love spending time with her, but I also was like, I got to figure out how to make these rolls, so that, I can have them the rest of my life. All right, so Joanna and I traveled to New Braunfels a few years ago, and we made the rolls with her, and part of the process was you had your dough and you just made it, but then you put it in a warm oven and you just let it sit there and it rises. Anyway, it has something to do with the leaven. I know that. Unleavened, we have flatbread, right? It doesn't rise. But this, anyway, so we made rolls with Oma, and there's the dough after it had risen. Anyway, so perhaps, there's something to that, right? The kingdom, right? It rises, there's that parallel. Anyway, so that's drawing pretty deep into it, but, again, the basic spiritual truth, a large heavenly kingdom will grow from something small. Yes?
I would like to say something about the leaven. I think if you think about the process like you were talking about of what's going on when you add yeast to the dough, you put it there for a purpose, so it's being planted there with a purpose, but it duplicates and it grows over time. That yeast is, multiplying, and it's eating up all of the sugars and the flour and the water, and it's creating gases, and all of these things are happening just from one little portion of yeast being added to the flour, and then by the end, it's all encompassing. It takes up all of the flour is touched by the yeast. So if you think about that analogy, comparing it to us and our deeds and the things that we do, we're put here with a purpose, and that purpose through our deeds can grow over time, and it can touch many things and many people in a lot of different areas. The difference is we don't necessarily get to see the physical outcome of that, but God sees that, and He knows that, and that's why we're put here.
All right, thank you, Ian. I hadn't thought of that, but it's a good point. Brian has some input, and I think we definitely have time, so I'd love to hear what Brian would say.
I'm going to pick on a little word that's in here. It's the word hidden. It reminds me also of the other parable of the treasure hidden in the field. But in Scripture, it speaks repeatedly of the mysteries of Christ, the mystery of the kingdom. The word mystery literally means that which is covered up, that which is hidden, and it's hidden by God. The word is called the revelation, which literally means to uncover. So we have this hidden pearl, this hidden treasure that is revealed to us through God's word, and when we get it, it is a treasure of immense, extraordinary value. And that's what I'm picking up here, that this leaven is hidden, but when discovered, it produces such wonderful things. So I think of the word, who can neglect such a great salvation?
All right, thank you. That's a good transition into, oh, no, Albert, we have time. So, but I was like, all right, value. Let's go to the treasure and the pearl. But let's hear Albert.
Now you put pressure on me. It's dawned on me, the kingdom of heaven is like, again, what did the people of this time desire in this kingdom? Palace, power, overtake those other nations around them. And here he is again, turning the world upside down. A mustard seed, if you physically have seen the mustard seed, smaller than the sesame seed, but yet it produces this huge tree. And the leaven is hidden or wrapped up in it, and it overpowered those of this world think the flour would convert the leaven into flour, but it's the total opposite. The smallest thing converted the larger overpowering thing into. And so he's trying, just the kingdom of heaven is like, again, people of the time as well as me today quit thinking of this worldly kingdom and think totally opposite. It's not being served, it's service. It's not gaining treasures, it's sharing your wealth with those who are in need. And so it's dawning on me as we were going through this.
All right. Thank you, Albert. Okay. You made me think of something. Now it's hard. I was like, it was at the beginning of what you said. Now it's gone. I wanted to point out, though, now I'm starting to remember. On Wednesday, I talked about two general kind of responses to these parables, and I said the crowds, don't really perhaps understand it like the disciples do, or they're not seeking the information the same way. And I kind of wrestled with that. I was like, surely there was perhaps someone, and I generalized the crowds. There's probably, maybe the point is there's a mixture of receptance, right? And so what I was kind of thinking was like, you can sit here and listen to parables and be like, somebody be like, hey, what did Jesus teach you? I don't know, something about bread, and the person who doesn't really listen versus the person who really wants to understand. Those are like the disciples here. We saw with the parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds. They asked, hey, what's this mean? Like they really wanted to understand what Jesus was teaching. And so I think that's kind of the point. We didn't read it today, but when Jesus talks about the different ways that the parables are received in verses 10 through 16, and there's going to, there's people who really want to understand the kingdom, people who want to follow, who want to really, who are very invested, and there's people who are kind of like, kind of autopilot, as Daniel preached last week, not really, they're not all in, right? They're not as invested or interested. Something to think about. All right, so hidden treasure and pearl of value. Okay, so again, another double parable where they have the same spiritual truth that at least that you could derive from them. So with the treasure, the kingdom is like a hidden treasure that a man finds, but then he buries it, and then he buys the property where he buries it, right? But, oh yeah, important fact, he sells all he has to buy the property where he buries the treasure, okay? And so the spiritual truth that I found in there was that the kingdom of heaven is worth more than anything we have here on earth because he sold all he had. We see a similar point made with the pearl of great value. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking pearls. He finds one pearl of great price, great value, and then he sells all he has to buy that pearl, right? And so same kind of spiritual truth I see there. And along those lines, it seems like both of them felt a need to really seize the opportunity, okay? Especially, I guess, with the pearl. The other guy buried it in the body. It's kind of a weird thing, right? But with the pearl, someone saw it and they're like, oh, I need this. They sell everything they have, and they make sure that they possess that. And so that's what I was able to pull out of that. Anybody? Daniel and Lee. Let's start with Lee. He's closer to Alex. Oh, Daniel has a mic.
Daniel has a mic. It's interesting to me on these two parables, the persons involved take everything they have to buy this one item, and all of that, all the spiritual truths you talked about are true. But it's interesting that suddenly, if you sold everything you had and you have a pearl and you have a field, you're also suddenly dependent on someone else or something, in this case, the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, which falls in line with his teachings about, giving up the things,
right.
The Son of Man has no place to stay, those kind of things, and the idea that, Solomon was the lilies outshine Solomon, and all those references of giving up what you have that makes you, or makes you independent, and
yes.
Suddenly you've given up everything to buy this one thing.
Yes, so to take, like one of the passages Lee's referring to is whoever loses his life for my sake will find it, right? You're only worthy of me if you'll take up your cross and follow me. So there's that language that we've seen in previous lessons of being willing to sacrifice everything for Jesus. Daniel.
I don't know. It's possible that this is a stretch, but it does seem like from the way that these two parables are told And just thinking, as you say, that there's two parables back to back that essentially say the same thing. So you start thinking, well, what's the difference? Why do we need both of them, But it has always seemed to me like the person comes across the treasure in two different ways. That the first person, and this would be maybe where there's room for different interpretation, but it seems like the person with the treasure in the field stumbles upon it. I thought I remembered that being the phrase, but apparently it's not, at least in my translation. But the person doesn't seem to be looking for it, but he finds it. And upon finding it, although he didn't know he was looking for it, he realizes the value of it, gives everything up, as we've been saying, to find that. The second person is clearly seeking after something of great value, finds it, and then sells all that he has. And I don't know, it seems to me like we could all, put ourselves in one category or the other, that our encounter with the gospel was either not of our own doing at all. I mean, obviously on some level, it's never of our own doing, the Lord provides, but, we stumbled upon it, and then we were faced with the decision, what are we going to do with it? Or maybe our story is that, we were seeking and seeking and seeking for something of the greatest value, and then once we found it, we held on to it. So either way, whether it's an accidental stumbling upon the treasure of the gospel, or whether we, were looking in all the wrong places and then finally found it, the end result is the same, as we've been saying. We give up everything to hold on to it and not let it go.
All right. Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't even notice that, the difference in how they came across their treasures or their valued items.
Well, that probably means I made it up then.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It says he found it and covered it up, but, it doesn't say he was seeking after treasure in a field. I don't think it's a
I was
far
kind of thinking about that same thing now that you brought up. It's like, well, if they found it, finders keepers, right? They get to keep it, right? But I think to your point is, however they found it, they were willing to give up everything to obtain it. And so I kind of like it.
I would say both men, they see what true value is. And in today's world, we see things of value, things that are worth a lot of money, or even we make investments in things that we find valuable. Well, the question is do we invest in the spiritual things that hold the greatest value?
And if you remember in the parable of the sower, the thorns part of that was love of money. It was like the cares for riches in the world, right? So definitely could be something that stands in the way. Okay. So, all right, we're doing good. Okay, so, and that basically ends the parables. However, there is this like last section where Jesus asks his disciples, because there is a transition where in this chapter, I don't know if you noticed it, where Jesus originally, he's on a boat teaching out to the crowds, right? But then there's a point where is it? 36, where he left the crowds and went into the house. All right, so he must have gotten off the boat. All right, but and then he's with just the disciples, and so the disciples, he asked them, in verse 51, have you understood all these things? And they say yes. It may be, I don't know. Yeah, that's one of those things. You can debate that all you want. I mean, we know that some things didn't sink in, but they think they understand. But then Jesus says, therefore, every scribe, hold on one sec. Okay. Every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old. And that in itself is a parable, right? I mean, there's a comparison here. So we have new and old treasures. First off, he says, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom. And perhaps he chose that word because scribes were considered learned people, well-educated, but they're also teachers of the book. So there's kind of this implication, that the disciples would need to really know their stuff. But then further, and they were being instructed by Jesus at this time, right? And taught. But he then says every scribe is like a master of a house or a householder who brings out treasure. Okay, and so I mean, what we have here is basically an explanation of what happened, right? Because right now, we've got the book of Matthew's treasure, right? It's got the new and the old. I mean, right? Like it brings the old in. We've been seeing that over and over again, right? And so that's my interpretation of what the apostles will show the continuity of the law and everything that came before and how it all leads to Jesus. Anyhow, and they do that by interpreting Old Testament prophecies, showing the relationship between the old and the new, and like I just said. Okay, and so that's how I understand this. It's kind of perhaps in some ways a prophecy, but also delivering maybe an expectation, with of how it needs to be done. Like a workman, a master workman of the word, someone who really needs to know what they're talking. Although he did say the Holy Spirit would tell them what they're supposed to say. But that's all I've got for it. Okay, so we have just a few more minutes. I probably will finish a little early here, but here's a review of chapter 13 parables, kind of grouped up. There were basically 5 groupings, 5 general messages. The sower, which showed us how the word would be received, how it is received still today. We have the parable of the weeds and the dragnet. Basically, there will be an end, and there's going to be a judgment. And then we've got the mustard seed, small to big, hidden treasure. Kingdom of heaven is worth more than anything here on earth. And then the new and old treasures. Apostles must and will be skilled in the old and the new. Anybody have any, I didn't give a chance for input with the old and new treasures. We have 3 minutes. All right, Wayne.
We have, thanks. Whenever we have this shift in verse 36, so he left the crowds in verse 36, and then he's talking to the disciples, so we have to assume it's a more intimate group of people, perhaps even his apostles, those who are closest to him. In that context is where we have the hidden treasure, the pearl of great value in the net, and perhaps something that can give us some real meaning to these passages is that he's talking to the apostles about the treasure, the pearl, the net. And so to what extent were the apostles then to give for the kingdom of heaven with the treasure, with the pearl? We see all the things that they went through, either historically or in the Bible. And then through that context, we're supposed to look at it the same way, is to sacrifice the same amount that they did.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, Wayne, and everybody for your inputs. Was that the second bell? I think probably is. Okay. On Wednesday, Daniel will lead us through a lesson on chapter 14. So read that, and we will see you then, Lord willing.